Hi, welcome to EDF4004, week 4. Now this week we're going to be discussing designing rubrics and marking criteria. So we're first going to start quite simplistically for some of you, and it will be more complex for others. But we're just going to talk a little bit about scoring, so numbers will be involved. Now these are just the basics in regards to the different scoring in regards to, and obviously this gets more, it can become more complex, but for most of you, you'll just need to know these simple sorts of things. We talk about scoring in regards to usually the raw scores, percentage scores, and then also weighting scores or weighted scores. So I'm just going to talk about those three very briefly. Now for some of you this will seem very simplistic, so you can go ahead and skip on. But for some of you, this might be the first time that you're actually being introduced to some of this terminology and to these ideas. Even though it's very simple maths, it is something that you will do quite regularly when you're scoring, particularly tests. So scoring tests results in a raw score, which basically then turns into a percentage score to give you the total score. So the raw score is the total points earned. So the example is if you have a test of 16 items and each are worth 2 points with the possibility of partial credit. And then there's also a short essay rated with a 20-point rubric. So the raw score is the sum of the points earned on each of the 16 items plus the rating of the essay. So if you add all of that up, the perfect test would have a raw score of 52. So that's 32 for the 16 items and then 20 for the rubric. So then we need to get a percentage score from the raw score. So the formula for that is 100 times the raw score divided by the perfect score, or the total possible points. So given the previous example, in the 52-point test, a student earns 25 points on the first 16 items and 17 on the essay. So the calculation would be 100 times 25 plus 17 divided by 52 equals 80.8%. So that gives you the percentage score. Now, if you want to have, you can also have subscores if you have a larger test, and particularly if the different sections of the test assess different objectives or different things. Particularly for you as a teacher, that gives you information about what sections they're getting and what they're not, or concepts they're getting. So you can definitely put kind of different section or subscores just for diagnostic purposes, or even for formative feedback for students to kind of say, well, I did really well on this section, but not on the section before or after. And then they know exactly what they need to work on. So the other thing is that you need to make sure that you know what the percentage means. So for example, in tertiary studies, in 80 here in Australia, 80.8% would just be an HD. So that's quite a good score. So you need to ensure that the rubrics, or particularly the rubrics, reflect the rating, which reflect the criterion. So does that actually reflect a high distinction, a very good score? So you need to make sure you do understand that. And for each, you need to make sure that you know what is the difference between an A and a B, and is that test reflecting that? Now you might give a test and you realize everyone does really well. Well, that will either mean that you've taught the content very well, or your students are, extremely bright, or there's something with the test. The test was a bit too easy, or something where there was answers kind of given within the test. So looking at how students have done and seeing, because one of the things that usually if it's a good test or a good assignment or assessment task, you're going to see a spread. So if you have just a normal class, and this is not always the case, sometimes you do have just a very bright class, or a class that really gets it, but usually you want to actually have an assessment task that can show a distribution of scores and be able to see a variety of different scores. So that shows that you're allowing the kind of high flyers in your class to really kind of to show that they're doing really well, but you're also kind of, showing the range of, and it's reflective of the range of learners in your class. So you need to make sure that, getting these scores should help you kind of identify, one, is the assessment tool valid in a way? Is it giving you the scores that give you somewhat of a spread, or the spread that you would expect for that particular class? And then you need to understand, make sure, whatever setting you're in, that that reflects, so that you can see the difference between an A and a B, and you understand what those levels are. So what is an 80? Is it a B or is it an A? What is it? And so on. So that needs to be very clear, not only for you but also for the students, so they can then interpret that percentage, because a percentage is just a percentage. They need to actually understand what that means in regards to their to the marking schedule. Weighted scores. This is when you can weight different sections of a test based on what you feel, and this is subjective, but the estimated value. So there's a couple of things why you might use weighted scores. Maybe there's a very important section and you want to make sure that that's weighted heavier than the other sections. But also you have kind of sometimes you have a task or you have a question that's really involved, but like in kind of comparison to another part of the test where there's lots of short answers, there's just more questions. Well, if you just do it by a raw score, you have the section with more questions is obviously going to have more impact. But you might have, like, for example, math, you might have a problem solving activity or some kind of authentic task that is actually only one question, but you want to, it shows that the students actually did a bit more work and there's a bit more importance than just the equation questions that, may have not been as involved. So if you do want to weight, have a weighted score, you have the weight times the raw score divided by the total points for the section. So, and also if you're going to weight the different sections, you need to make sure that all sections do add up to 100%, because you will find sometimes that people miss this and then you're going, oh, actually this doesn't add up. So all the weights need to add up to 100%. So here's an example for you. This test has 3 sections, or assessment task has 3 sections. The first and the second are worth 15 points with 1 point each. And this information here, this is something that this may be in like a scoring guide. So you need to, if you're going to weight things, you need to be actually, describing this in your scoring guide so that anyone could pick up your test and be able to score it, and we'd all get the same marks because we understand the scoring and how it's working. So section 1 and section 2 worth the same amount, 15 items worth 1 point each, so 15 points. Then the third section is a short essay worth 10 points. So the teacher wants to weight it as section 1 20%, section 2 40%, section 3 40%. So if a student earns 9 on section 1, 14 on section 2, and section 3 is 8, then you see this example in red, gives you an idea of what it would look like. So you have the weight, which is 20%, times the score, the raw score, 9, divided by the total score, 15, and then so on. And you add those together. And the important thing to see here is that with the weighted example, the student would get 81.3%. And if it wasn't weighted, it'd be 77.5%. So there is a difference here. So obviously, if there is, a higher importance for section 2 and section 3, then it will actually change the student's grade. So, this needs to be done if you do want to kind of weight things and show, I guess, certain value in a particular section, then this would work well to kind of provide you the score that reflects that. Okay, now on to scoring rubrics and scoring guides. Now, there's a lot of kind of confusion in regards to, well, what exactly is a scoring guide? Most of you would know what a rubric is, partly because here at university we use a lot of rubrics. So what is the difference between a scoring guide or rubric? Now, if you look at information, a lot of them actually, they use those terms interchangeably. But for example, in one of the documents that's in your resource file for this week, they argue that scoring guides include the points or ratings at each level to help in determining scores. So there's a bit more of a numerical kind of guide for the scoring guide rather than the rubric, which kind of looks at maybe not each section is numbers. But that kind of can depend on how you set up the rubric. So, but there is more of a focus on points and ratings in the scoring guide. Others say that rubrics are for teachers and students, so that rubrics are given to both students and teachers, and that provides formative feedback for students so they can self-assess themselves with the rubric, and so on, and then teachers obviously use it for their marking. And as opposed to scoring guides, which are just for teachers, and that's the idea that if your assessment task is given to any teacher, they will know exactly what they need to do, and they will all kind of administer the test the same way, and they would all score the test the same way. So the scoring guide is really to show teachers or assessors how to administer and how to score. Now, let me just make a note that even though the scoring guide may be meant only for the teachers and to kind of, net out that process of how you're going to administer the test and how you're going to score it, the test or assessment task still needs to be very clear to students on how they're being assessed. So in the actual test. So in the actual test, it's actually really helpful to say how much each section is worth for the students and how much, if there's a percentage or something like that. So students understand that, if it is, particularly if it's weighted, that this section is worth more points. And if they're if it's timed, they can then kind of adjust how much time they spend on things. So it's really important that students know upfront what they're going to be scored on, regardless, whether you're using a rubric or scoring guide. Those can be, if it's the test, the students actually need to know before they actually take the test, and particularly on the test, what sections are worth. And just for this unit, I'm going to take the position that scoring guide is often used for tests. So if you've chosen one of the two, you'll probably have a scoring guide for your test or your quiz. And this will show, as I said, it will first kind of any administrative information that you need to. So for me, if I was going to give your test to a group of students, this should have the information of any specific things in regards to giving, do the students need to have another piece of paper that they write equations on that then they then submit as well, anything like that, but also just basically itemizes each question and says what are possible answers, is it just 1 point, or if it's 2 points, is there partial credit, and then what is the what judgment are we making? So what are possible answers? So if they have 1 but not 2, then they only get partial credit, and so on. So it kind of goes through and is very clear about anything like that. So that means that it's reliable. So we're ensuring that the assessors are marking it the same. And also it just says the number of points that each section is worth. So here's an example, and I know this is grade 3, but this is an example of someone's, and this is just one page of it, but someone's scoring guide where they've actually given what's on the test, and then it says for this item a full credit response, so which is 2 points, includes these. For this item a partial credit response, so they would give them 1 point, includes this, and so on. So this is a very clear kind of scoring guide to say how exactly we would score this if we were going to score this test. All right, moving on. So rubrics. Now there are really, usually people just talk about rubrics, but there's actually 2 types of rubrics. We have analytic and general rubrics. Now most of you would have seen analytic rubrics, and part of that's because they just provide a little bit more information, and they're probably a little bit better to use for students in self-assessing and so on, and helping them see how things work out. Now I've used the example for this unit. Now let me just say that rubrics are hard to make, so mine is by far not perfect, and I am continually getting better at making rubrics. One of the hard things is knowing, because you don't want it to be too wordy, and if you even look at this first section here, you have you know, it's quite long. So you don't want to have it be too wordy, but it's making sure that the levels are clear. Now, just another thing. So if we look at the rows, so C1, C2, C3, and C4, those often are called, you can call them a couple of things. So sometimes they're called traits or criteria or performance elements or indicators. Okay, so depending on what you're reading, that's what they're called. So the rows are the criteria, the indicators, they're basically what we're assessing. And then the columns, so in this sense, H, D, D, C, those are called the levels. Okay, so that's just, you know, something that you'll read about, and it gets kind of confusing in how they, but basically rows are the criteria, the indicators, and then the levels are the columns. So analytic rubrics are multiple descriptors. So there's multiple things that we're looking at, and they tend to be more comprehensive. You will see that there is a second page. So this is just the first page of the rubric. There is a C5 and a C6 that looks at literacy and language. You'll also see that these sections are weighted. So important for you as you prepare for your assignment, simply because if you see, you know, talking about like the creation of the quiz or the task, 30%, then the scoring guide or marking rubric, 20%. So that means that 50% of your mark is actually the discussion. General rubrics. So this is the other kind of type of rubric, and it's not as specific, but can be very helpful and makes kind of marking quite easy. So it doesn't have different traits or indicators or performance elements criteria, but you have, actually the criteria is all lumped together. So for, you know, this is one that I used when I was in the States, so that's why there's slightly different grading or marking, so you don't have the HD. But this was one where you have just one description, so you don't have the different traits or indicators, there's just one description for each level. And it's basically being condensed, so instead of, you know, this first sentence being one criteria and the second one being a criteria, they're all just in one. But the main thing is that you have to make sure that you discriminate between, you know, what's the difference between an A plus and A. Those have to be enough different that it's easy for the assessor and for the student to be able to decide, oh, okay, this paper is definitely A plus and this one's an A. Okay. So how do I go about developing a rubric? Now in the resource file, there's a lot of different rubrics to have a look at. And then there's something that the article that you have read this week, I think What Makes a Good Rubric, and they talk about a whole lot of things that come in the appendix, and I've tried to put some of them up there in the resource file. So I know I was reading through it and I realized how kind of complicated it can be to read it because it's always referring to the appendix, but a lot of these are going to be in the resource file, so you can look at those, but they're really just examples to kind of get your head around and evaluate, which we will also be doing in the tutorial task. So we'll be looking at evaluating rubrics and trying to identify what we might do to make them stronger and so on. But they've also provided, Ardaran I'm not quite sure, Chapuis has put this rubric for rubrics to kind of help you then think about how to develop a rubric, and I think that's quite helpful. So have a look at that. That's the first thing, and when, you know, as you start thinking about developing a rubric, look at the rubric for rubrics. The next thing, if you're going to use an analytical rubric, you need to choose something from 3 to 6 traits or performance elements criteria. Then you need to write a definition or description of each of the above traits. Okay, so one of the easiest ways to do that in the chapter that you read this week talks about starting with the highest level and then to the lowest level and then working your way in and being able to discriminate between those different kinds of levels. So what is the difference between A and an E? And then, because that's actually quite easy to say, this is the best of the best, this is not cutting it. But then what makes it harder is making those distinctions as you go in. So what makes a difference between an A and a B? What's the difference between a B and a C, and so on. And the other thing is, that really is helpful is to be able to support your rubric with student samples. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of student samples to provide because this is the first year that we're doing this, this assignment, but student samples can really help as a way to kind of show students, this is what a B looks like, this is what a D looks like, and so on. And maybe it's not a full one, maybe it's just a section that kind of helps students understand what you're looking for. Now here's are just some questions to consider when creating a rubric or scoring guide. So what's important in the assignment? So you need to figure out, what do you actually want? What information do you want to get? What do you want to know? What do you want the students to demonstrate that they know? So what's important? And does the rubric cover everything of importance? And does it need to cover everything of importance? But it may only be able to cover some things. Well, what is most important? What do you really want to get out of it? Does the rubric or scoring guide align with Victorian curriculum content descriptors and descriptors and achievement standards? Now this is really, really important because when you go into your interviews and you go into, you write your cover letter, you need to be able to say that you can align your assessment tasks and your scoring guide or your rubric, so on, with the curriculum. This idea of alignment is really, really important, and so being able to make sure that the curriculum matches the assessment and these things are working together. Now, someone has mentioned something about the Australian curriculum. I'm happy for you to do it with the Australian curriculum, but if you're going to be teaching in Victoria, you will almost certainly be doing the Victorian curriculum. So it's just helpful, I thought, for your future jobs. Is the criteria clear and well organized? Can students clearly understand the difference between the levels? And this, again, is really hard, and this will be a challenge. This is kind of the you really will have to work through this and like I said, I'm not perfect at it. I'm still getting better at that. It's not the easiest thing. So, and then will you be giving letter or number grades? Will you be giving partial or only full credit? Is there a penalty for late work? These are all the questions that are important to be able to communicate to the students of what actually the scores mean. How much of what, like is it full or partial for each question, and so on. And then for number grades, what is the scale? What does 80% mean, as mentioned before? And what do these numbers signify? Does it mean, for in university, a C means that you're actually doing what you're supposed to be doing? And a lot of people think, oh, C, oh my gosh, that's a horrible mark. But actually, C is like you've done everything that you were supposed to do. D is a distinction. It means, wow, you've taken it to the next level. And HD is like, wow, amazing. So, but we often get in the sense, and it's understanding what do those different levels mean. And they often mean different things to different people. So it's really understanding what that means and ensuring that you communicate that with your students.